All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And on the program, joining me tonight on the program is a new guest. We got Owen Schalk. Owen is an independent journalist whose articles are often published at Canadian Dimension, which is one of Canada's biggest left-wing magazines. He's also a short story fiction writer and even writes essays on the arts and film. He is the author of Canada in Afghanistan, a story of military, diplomatic, political, and media failure 2003 to 2023, and he is the co-author of a new book, Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy, which he co-wrote with Yves Engler, who's a frequent guest on this show, good friends of this show, and we'll be exploring both books, but we'll mostly be talking about Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy. So, firstly, Owen, thanks so much for coming on the program and
Oh,
devoting some of your precious Saturday time to come on the program.
oh, thanks for the invite. I know it's very late there in Belgium, so I appreciate that you're staying up for this.
Oh, no problem, no problem. It's a real honor, and and so let's get underway. So your new book, which you collaborated with Yves Engler on, is a greatest hits, if you will, of how Canada has supported the suppression of democracy and true development around the world. Now, anyone who watches this program, knows that. So let me ask you if the book, covers, if the book covers either of these countries. And so I want to know: does the book cover or reveal Canada's role in the undermining of Michael Manley's Labour government in Jamaica during the 60s and 70s?
Actually, we don't cover that one. We cover a lot of countries sort of in the region and the hemisphere where Canada has engaged in all kinds of demonization and destabilization campaigns. With Jamaica, I think the feeling was there wasn't quite enough there to warrant a full chapter. I'm
Okay.
definitely familiar with some of Canada's actions toward the Michael Manley government in that time, mainly centered around like mining, aluminum mining, or bauxite that would be used for aluminum. I read somewhere, I don't remember exactly where, that there was a potential plan for Canadian forces to seize bauxite mines in the case of some kind of destabilization event within Jamaica. So Canadian troops had a plan to go in there and secure the mines, the Canadian-owned mines, in the case of an event like that. But in terms of sort of Canada undermining democracy in Jamaica, the feeling I think was that there just wasn't enough actual documentation there. But it's very interesting to me, this example of Michael Manley, because you do see some very similar things with other countries that we do cover, like the Canadian mines, the leftist leader who is viewed as a threat because he's taking a more nationalistic approach to resource development. You definitely see these things. So I understand in that way, like why you asked that question, because Michael Manley for sure is the type of leader who Canada would target
Yeah.
for demonization and destabilization.
Well, that's a perfect segue into this question, which is: does the book reveal further Canada's role in the coup against João Goulart in Brazil and supporting the right wing junta that took over, and any revelations in Canada supporting or de facto supporting the rise of Bolsonaro in recent events?
Yeah, so Brazil is a country in the book that gets two chapters devoted to it. The coup
Okay,
against João Goulart and then also the overthrow of Dilma Rousseff decades later.
interesting. Okay.
The coup against João Goulart, that one's not so fresh in my mind. That was one of the ones that I wrote first for the book, but absolutely there is evidence of Canada being worried about the Goulart government. It's coming to power, saying a lot of the similar things that get the hackles raised in North America, in Washington and in Ottawa, that kind of raise an eyebrow amongst these people. Things about more kind of internally directed resource development. He had, Joe Goulart, that is, he had an economic advisor. His name escapes me, but he was very informed by like dependency theory. These questions of how do we take an underdeveloped country and develop the economy develop the resources, develop the population without becoming subjugated by North American capital and by North American power. So Goulart was very he was thinking these things through. I think he wanted an alternative development path. And when the military then overthrows him, Canada welcomes it. They don't condemn the coup, obviously. Behind the scenes, there's a feeling that they approve of it. And Canadian investment, which had been present to some extent under Goulart, it really increases then. The company Brascan would be an example of that. The Canadian octopus, it was called, because it was so powerful. It had so many. It had its hands on so many economic levers in Brazil. And then you see, as the decades move forward, that Canadian mining becomes very prominent in Brazil. Canadian oil and gas exploration. A couple of years ago, I don't know if it still says this, but on the kind of Canadian government website under Brazil, one of the things that the Canadian government was emphasizing was that there are investment opportunities in oil and gas, and that, this is great. We should promote Canadian investment there, promote Canadian investment in mining in Brazil. Now, these are things that might not have been possible under a Goulart government, or, a government that was more influenced by his view on things. But then Lula, he comes to power during the so-called pink tide, this progressive wave. And he kind of straddles a line where he's not as socialist as a Hugo Chavez. He's not as demonized as a Hugo Chavez by Canada. But there's always a sense, I think, kind of like Rafael Correa too, with some of these leaders who come to power. There's a clear sense that Canada would like somebody else in there, that somebody like Lula, just, he's a little too independent, especially on things like foreign policy. He makes, well, I
Interesting.
mean, we see that now with Ukraine for sure, with Venezuela as well. I mean, it's not, I mean, yeah, that's a whole other question. But at the time, you have Lula in power. He leaves office, very popular. Dilma Rousseff comes into power afterward. She succeeds him, and the Brazilian right really starts making moves at that point to overthrow her. And we see that culminates in the legal coup of 2016, I believe. So then after that, they're moving into a new election. Lula da Silva is imprisoned. He's prevented from running. And Canada really doesn't say anything about it, which is very interesting, because at the same time, Canada was making so much noise about Venezuela, so much noise about Maduro, how he was anti-democratic, how he was running a dictatorship, how he was locking up the opposition, how this was so terrible, making so much noise about that, not saying anything about Brazil. So that's a very clear example of this hypocrisy. Because, well, like what did Canada get out of a leader like Bolsonaro, a leader of the hard right? They got open markets, they got investment opportunities, which is what Canada is always looking for around the global south, anywhere. Canada just wants opportunities for Canadian capital. They don't get that in Venezuela. They do get that in Brazil under Bolsonaro. So with those two countries especially, you see it's almost like an interesting experiment. Like
Well,
these two countries.
that's interesting, and then I actually have to ask this follow up then about Lula. Is now like a lot of Lula's left critics think that Lula didn't do enough to tackle income inequality, didn't do enough to rein in big business and so forth, like and so forth like that. Lula was at and is it safe to say when it comes to international affairs, sort of, putting aside Lula's defense of the Palestinian people and Lula trying to always be a mediator between countries, although his policies on Haiti are absolutely grotesque. But another that's another topic for another day. Although it does need to be explored, but but there was a period where it seemed as if like Lula had this like wonderful like honeymoon period, and same with Delma when it came to uh, Kevin Rudd's Australia, Obama's United States, and to various degrees Stephen Harper and the early Trudeau regime, but but it sounds to me, the fact that like Canada de facto supported the rise of a very reactionary, grotesque fascist like Bolsonaro. That's because like Lula actually did have like some level of like protection of like rainforests and stuff like that, and making sure that like whatever profits that big business was going, that it did go into programs to help alleviate extreme poverty and helping the more uh and helping people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, like with social mobility and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard one commentator describe Lula as saying that his government, made life better for rich people, but it also made life better for poor people. So, he wasn't a radical figure at all, really. He was just, yeah, promoting, education, investment in public services, alleviating poverty, not as much as he could have, but in some important ways. Well, rich people got richer. It was both. And like you say, his position on Haiti was completely aligned, really, with Canada, with the US, with Europe. Really, probably the biggest stain on his legacy, as far as I'm concerned. But I think the fact that Canada really made it clear that they're happier with somebody like Bolsonaro shows that you can give imperialism quite a bit, but what they want at the end of the day is total subservience. And if you don't give them that, then they will support your ouster. Like I mentioned Rafael Correa earlier. There was Canadian mining in Ecuador under Rafael Correa, but still, when the police tried to overthrow him in the capital, Quito, I don't remember the exact year that happened. Canada uh, was one of the only countries in the whole hemisphere that didn't release a statement about it until after it was clear that Correa was going to remain in power. And then they said, "Oh, we condemn this coup attempt," but they made it so clear
I
that
did.
if Correa
I
had
think
been
I did.
removed from power, yeah.
Rafael Correa was almost overthrown. I completely missed that, but
Yeah, it was police officers in the Capitol. They were complaining about wages, even though wages under Correa had actually gone up for police. Uh, in their mind, I suppose they hadn't gone up enough. And yeah, they took him hostage essentially. And ALBA, these regional organizations, the ones helmed mainly by Venezuela, they were immediately condemning it. They were saying this is unacceptable. Release Correa. He has to serve out his term. Canada didn't say anything until the dust had settled and it was clear that Correa would remain in power. So Canada, yeah, like Correa was not a radical leftist. Correa was not somebody like Hugo Chavez who was taking over control of resources, who was saying like, no, imperialism out. He did shut down the US military bases, but he didn't go as far as he could have, which again shows, just like with Lula, you can give imperialism a few things. You can give imperialism many things. But at the end of the day, if you're not subservient, you're still a target.
and that's a perfect segue to this question, which is: does the book talk at all about Canada and Argentina? Because Argentina, which which it's a friend of mine gave me a book about Argentina, which I can't wait to read because Argentina has quite a fascinating history, and I know that Juan Perón, who often people, when people think of Juan Perón, they think of a guy that allowed Nazis to to
Mhm.
flee to his country, but Juan Perón, that's an overly simplistic image, and that was very wrong of him to have done that. He had like, but at the same time, like Juan Perón, like it's kind of like He kind of had like this multiple personality disorder where he did a lot of stuff which was very business friendly, and then did a lot of stuff which was very like pro workers, and also
Mhm.
and also like like a Lula before him had kind of like tried to do like his own like non-aligned you know uh, foreign policy, and the reason why he was overthrown had nothing to do with with his like autocracy or anything like that. It had to do with the fact that like he was doing more left-wing policies, and then like the very right-wing military overthrew him.
Mhm.
So I'm curious if if you and Eve uncovered anything about Canada's role in all of that, and of course, the overthrow of his wife and the reign of terror, which was, the far right junta during the 70s, known as the Dirty Wars.
Yeah, so we don't have a chapter on Argentina. We couldn't really find the amount of documentation regarding Argentina that we found with countries like Chile, for example, with Venezuela, Honduras, Haiti, these other countries in the hemisphere. With Argentina, we just didn't have the same amount to draw from, I would say. But there is an interesting history there too, in that Canada didn't, during the reign of terror that you mentioned, Canada really didn't organize internationally to try to overthrow Videla, to try to overthrow the junta like they did in Venezuela. Canada didn't say much about it. And that points to another interesting element of Canadian foreign policy, which is this not the overthrow of democracy, but the supporting of these extremely violently anti-democratic governments that already exist. So this is a question I've got in relation to this book a few times. Like, is there a chapter on the Philippines? Marcos, Canada's relationship with Marcos.
Funny, that was actually
Canada's,
my next question. But yeah, so
yeah,
skip right
yeah.
ahead.
I preempted you, but yeah. And these are examples of Canada supporting these extreme right-wing, violent, anti-democratic governments. Indonesia is another one, although actually there is a chapter on Indonesia in the book, 1965. But some of these countries, like the Philippines, like Argentina, I think they would be good chapters in another kind of book, a book on Canada supporting these military dictatorships, supporting these anti-democratic governments, rather than supporting coups that bring them to power, which is the focus of this book.
Interesting. And
Mhm.
well, actually, anything about the far right junta in South Korea during much of the Cold War?
Yeah, this is actually a question I've got before too, and it's a similar thing. It's like Canada for sure was very involved in supporting South Korea. Canada, of course, was involved in the Korean War, sent tens of thousands of troops to the Korean War to support really US imperialism in Asia. But as it comes to Canada's relationship with the junta in South Korea, again, I think that would be a really good investigation for a different kind of book. But yeah, in this one, there wasn't, it didn't really fit with the theme that we had built.
Same with Taiwan and British rule over Hong Kong.
Yeah, similar thing. Although you're listing a lot of chapters that would be good for another book, I think, maybe down the
Well,
line.
make sure to beat Eve to it.
Yeah.
He's already
I don't
got
know
like
if that's possible. Yeah.
he's already got enough books under his belt.
Yeah.
But well, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure you what about Iran? Does the book talk about Canada's support for the Shah and the first answer that question, and I actually do have a follow up question, which is also related to Iran.
Yeah, we do have a chapter on Iran, 1953, the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, and kind of Canada's passive but still noteworthy role in that, because the coup against Mossadegh, it was really like a US UK joint coup, the two of them working together. Mossadegh, he had nationalized the oil, which it was mainly British capital invested in that. And Britain, as far as I understand it, was really the driving force behind this coup, but they got the US on board by painting Mossadegh as a communist, by saying that this government would spread the Soviet influence in the Middle East. And that's really when the US got on board with the coup. And at this time, the 1950s, early 1950s, Canada is mainly aligned with the UK at this point, mainly an appendage of the UK, of the British Empire. We'd later become more of an appendage of the US empire, but at this time it's more of a British Empire thing.
Yeah.
So we were right on board, demonizing Mossadegh, saying just all kinds of absurd things about him in private, in public. And then after he had nationalized the oil, and then when the coup happens, 1953, bringing the Shah back to power, we, Canada, that is, we had a very good relationship with the Shah over many years. It involved weapons sales, bringing him to Canada, showing him around, talking about how we have this great bilateral relationship with the Shah of Iran. So yeah, just another one example of many, over 20 in the book, of Canada undermining these popular leaders because they're trying to take control of their resources. And then this new, completely anti-democratic, horrific government gets the full-throated support of Canada. We see it over and over again.
And I'm and my so my follow-up question about Iran would be this, which is what's Canada's role with the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini? And now this might be controversial for people who are involved in the Iran, solidarity movement, but Ayatollah Khomeini is an interesting character because he is very, I mean, socially he is very regressive. Like he's no secular leftist and so forth like that. And apparently, declassified British documents actually showed that the Thatcher government was actually very happy with the idea of Khomeini getting into power and using him to further eradicate the Iranian Communist Party and other left parties. And so they thought that he was basically a person that they could still do business with since the people were fed up with the Shah. And I'm wondering if the book reveals anything about Canada with regards to Khomeini, but then later turning on Khomeini when he later, like Mossadegh before him, wants more profits of oil to go to his people, and of course once he starts talking about like a global Shia revolution, that's when the U.S., France, Britain, and Canada really start to, turn against, Iran and, of course, supporting Saddam Hussein in that very grotesque war that happened between Iran and Iraq in the throughout much of the 1980s.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I can't say I know a whole lot about that. These documents that you refer to, though, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, this would fit very well into this history of Britain, of America, of Canada, supporting religious fundamentalism, you could call it, against the left in the region, in order to suppress these sentiments that come up with figures like Mossadegh, who want to nationalize the resources. So I could totally see these Western powers viewing Khomeini in that way, not fully understanding his thought process or who he was. And of course, when he comes to power, he does kill a lot of the left. The Tudeh party, for example, the Iranian Communist Party, essentially wipes them out, which I'm sure the Western powers at the time looked on very positively. But then, of course, you have him making the statements about how the Soviet Union is, how does he put it, the lesser evil, the lesser demon, but the US empire is the biggest one of all.
Oh, really?
Cutting this independent track, saying not east, not west, we're our own thing. I'm sure that would have totally baffled the Western leaders and contributed to this turn that you mentioned, where suddenly Iran is a pariah state. Suddenly it's okay to arm Saddam Hussein, to go in there and gas people and massacre people, bomb the cities, whatever. Yeah, and as for Canada's role in all of this, this is a history that I haven't investigated too much, but it would be very interesting to see what Canadian officials were saying at the time, to see if what they were saying matched with what British officials were saying or American officials. Because now we are in a very dangerous position with Iran, listing the IRGC as a terrorist state, really not saying anything as Israel bombs Iran, as there's this risk of a regional war. I mean, the regional war is already happening to some extent, but this risk of open warfare between these countries in the Middle East, as that risk rises, Canada says nothing because we have such an ingrained anti-Iranian policy in Canada, which I suppose is a bit of a tangent related to your question, but just to connect it to the present, I wanted to emphasize that when Khomeini comes to power in 79, maybe there was a bit of ambivalence about who this figure was. But now, I mean, I think it's very clear where Canada stands in relation to Iran. And as Israel is really dragging the region and the world to the brink of abyss, Canada seems to be completely for it and completely against any forces, be it Iran, be it Hezbollah, be it, Yemen, totally against any forces that are trying to rein this in.
And actually, another follow-up question related to Iran before we get back to what's in the book is I'm curious, what do you think should be the response of anti-imperialists when it comes to when it comes to when it comes to Iran? Arnold August is going to be on the show later this month to and I'm hoping to talk to him about Iran, and he's a very very strict anti-imperialist, which is we should not be, which is nobody should be spending any time demonizing Iran, and Iran should be should be left alone. So I'm curious. I'm curious. What do you think should be the anti-imperialist response to Iran when because I know some on the left and I believe even like the Iranian community is quite bitterly divided on, we don't like the Islamic Republic of Iran, but we don't want to be like pawns for Western imperialists to overthrow the government, especially if we know that they're going to install some kind of a cult like the MEK or some neo-Shah government, because I know that the Shah's son is actually quite heavily involved in in color revolutions and trying to overthrow the government and even working with the Israel lobby to do that. So I'm curious. Yeah, so I'm curious. What do you think? What do you think anti-imperialists' response to Iran is when legitimate grievances like women's rights and so forth do come about?
Yeah, I mean, on these questions, I don't weigh in necessarily. From my perspective, at least my focus is on things that need to change within Canada, within Canadian foreign policy, within Canadian domestic policy. For me, these are the things that I dedicate my energies to mainly. The question of Iran, of the Iranian government, is a complicated one, as you say. I have various opinions about it, but I don't spend any time criticizing the Iranian government in my work because I feel what's the point of that? I mean, people get anti-Iranian perspectives and propaganda all the time. I'm here to talk about Canada. I'm here to talk about how Canada could have a better relationship with Iran and should have a more productive, mutually beneficial relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran. My own particular views on the government there, I don't go writing about them necessarily. From an anti-imperialist perspective, though, which I consider myself an anti-imperialist. Yeah, my view is Canada stop the escalation. US stop meddling, lift the sanctions on Iran. These are only hurting ordinary people in Iran. So I guess in that way, I do prioritize imperialism in my analysis. You know, any positive changes or what some people would view as positive changes to the Iranian system, to Iranian society, those would only come about, in my view, in a sanctions-free Iran. It's not the sanctions make everything worse. The military escalations make everything worse. So that should be the starting point, from my view, for anti-imperialists.
And now, actually, that's a perfect segue to get back to your book. I'm going to switch my questions around, which is the color revolutions in Russia that led to the dissolution of the USSR, supporting Boris Yeltsin and his suppression and eradication of the left and his junk economics, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Does the book talk at all about Canada's role in the dissolution of the USSR and actually backing very reactionary movements and a bunch and wolves in sheep's clothing?
Yeah, so yeah, we have two chapters really that deal with these questions. Russia, 1993, I believe, the year that Boris Yeltsin bombed the parliament, which Canada supported, and then Ukraine, 2014, of course. And just to start with Russia, you know, 93 in Russia, this was a time when the neoliberal reforms that Canada supported, they were really starting to bite and they were really hurting the population a lot, which was leading to any popularity that the neoliberals had, led by Yeltsin, to really collapse. It cratered their support as people began to experience the effects of these policies, and it led to more popularity amongst those opposing them, including the Communist Party. 3 years later, 96, the Communist Party probably would have won that election if the US hadn't went in there and rigged it in Yeltsin's favor. But 93, you had the elected parliament opposing Yeltsin's policies, saying, you're going way too fast. You can't do this. This is destroying the country. And Yeltsin essentially said, fuck you. I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm backed by the US. You can't stop me. And he bombed the parliament, and he massacred protesters in the streets of Moscow. And Canada supported it completely. Canadian prime ministers like Brian Mulroney, Kim Campbell, they're on record very publicly saying, we love Yeltsin. He's amazing. He supports democracy. He supports freedom of the press as he's closing down opposition newspapers after 93. Oh, he supports home ownership was one of the things I saw. Yeah, as he's, shutting down public housing, as people are being kicked out on the street, he supports, housing. It's ridiculous. But it was so important to imperialism to destroy Russia, to make an example of Russia after the Soviet years, that nobody cared. Canada didn't care. Canada still doesn't care about quality of life there at all. It was about making an example, and they did it. Ukraine 2014, a little bit of a different context. Ukraine has its own internal dynamics, of course, and within those, Canada aligned themselves, unsurprisingly, with sort of the Western Ukrainian far-right faction. Canada has a big Ukrainian Canadian community that supports that group. You see it through the UCC, organizations like that. Christopher Freeland, of course, has a very colorful history with these figures, shall we say,
Oh,
to put it
yeah.
kindly.
Well,
And when
her grandfather was like
yes, the
was a
Nazi the
Ukrainian
Nazi
Nazi
past,
publisher. So
which she said was Russian disinformation. I remember that. But yeah, so you have Viktor Yanukovych comes to power in Ukraine, really putting forward a neutral position, a non-aligned position, saying we want to have relations with the EU, we want to have relations with Russia. And that led to a segment of Ukrainian society really becoming incensed. And of course, it led to the European powers, to the US, to Canada, putting a target on his back. And when in 2014, these protests are happening against Yanukovych's rule, this elected president, by the standards that we measure a lot of our allies, he did come to power in an election that was free and fair. Canada is on the ground supporting the anti-Yanukovych factions, giving our embassy up as basically like a hub for the opposition, saying, come to the embassy, organize here, making all kinds of public statements about Yanukovych that were just ridiculous, Harper saying he wants to restore the Soviet Union. Like, it's insane, the things that they were saying about Yanukovych, but that's the demonization element that I talked about. There's the demonization and there's the destabilization. And the demonization works to legitimize the destabilization efforts. So then, of course, Yanukovych, he's kicked out in a military coup, leaves the country. And I mean, we know what happened since then. Donetsk, Lugansk, they declare their independence, civil war in Ukraine. After that, Canada supporting the central government there, launch Operation Unifier to train Ukrainian troops, some of them neo-Nazis. And then this just spirals into the invasion that happens February 2022. A preventable invasion, an invasion that didn't have to happen, but the coup in 2014 that Canada supported really set the dominoes falling. And here we are now. But this just shows these color revolutions, they take advantage of these political divides, these linguistic divides, these ethnic divides in these post-Soviet countries that really under the Soviet Union, these tensions were not as inflamed as they are now. But when the economic conditions collapse, when people's lives are made worse, when they're more desperate, these collective values crumble. People are more tribalistic. They have their camp. They demonize the other camp. And imperialism takes advantage of that to undermine the people they don't want in power. And you see that in Ukraine. You see it in Georgia, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. You see the same thing. It's over and over again in these post-Soviet countries. And Canada is there on the wrong side of history every time. And Russia 93, Ukraine 2014, I mean, these are clear examples of Canadian policy against democracy, just making everything worse.
That's I was planning on asking this as a follow-up question, but before I get but yeah, so before I get to my second to last three nations, I have to then ask this, which is now Viktor Yanukovych, he wasn't a leftist. I think it's fair to say, I mean, he would probably yeah, right wing. I think it's safe to say that he was a fairly center right, a very center rightish kind of guy. So what does that say about Canada and imperialism in general when even a person like that who would have been very who would have been very business friendly towards Canadian business, or somebody like Mobutu who Canada helped prop up. He was very right wing and so forth. Was very business friendly, no doubt. What does that say about Canadian imperialism that that Canada can just overthrow a center right government like Yanukovych, uh, completely destroy Congo and make people's lives 10 times worse with the overthrow of Mobutu and installing some bootlicker like Laurent Kabila, who later gets killed by his Rwandan proxies, and then later having Paul Kagame running rough shots, not just in Uganda against Milton Obote and propping up Youri Museveni, but then later a reign of terror in Rwanda and of course Congo. I'm curious I'm curious your response on that, as well as I'll just throw one more thing in there. Putin, that is not a left winger. That's a very fiscally conservative, socially conservative guy, and yet like Canada and its allies are so determined to want these ridiculous, like endless cold wars, and now I guess hot wars with Russia, even though Russia's no longer a far left autocratic government.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because something that Eve and I touch on in the book is the fact that most of these coups that we chronicle in the book, most of them we were able to find, well, I'll just say most of them were against leftist leaders. So I'll put it that way. Most of them were against leaders who had nationalized or were interested in nationalizing the resources, interested in marginalizing foreign investors, including Canadian capital, and promoting the interests of the majority of the population. Most of the governments that Canada targets, this is their character, this is their nature. But you're right, Ukraine.
Jacobo Arbenz.
Yeah, exactly. It's over and over again. But like you say, with Ukraine in 2014, they overthrow Yanukovych, who would agree with them, I would think, in a lot of ways. Like you say, pretty right-wing leader. But even the conclusion that we come to is that the coup in Ukraine in 2014 was motivated more by military or geostrategic goals than by economic goals, which kind of makes it, in some ways, an outlier, or it's one of the exceptions to this rule that Canada will target the left, will target leftist leaders. Not all the time, as Ukraine shows. Because Yanukovych, yeah, I mean, in one sense, he wasn't giving the West everything they wanted. Like, they wanted to pass this EU deal. They wanted more opportunity for investment, it seems, in Ukraine, even though they were already getting quite a bit. They wanted subservience militarily, which they weren't getting from Yanukovych. And yeah, it's really interesting because it just depends on your analysis. Like, all of these things are present to an extent in all of these coups, like the geostrategic, the military, the economic, but in different proportions they're present. And I think with Ukraine, the major proportion is the military, it's the geostrategic. And similar thing with Russia, I would say. But it just goes to show there's several potential reasons why Canada would interfere in the affairs of a sovereign state, as Canada often does. But it boils down to these economic or these geopolitical questions. And no matter which one is in the forefront, you always see the same things. You see the demonization, the diplomatic isolation, the aid cutoff, things like that. Often the funding of opposition groups and destabilization in the case of Venezuela, openly calling for the military to overthrow the government. And you mentioned Congo, you mentioned Rwanda, which is something I've been thinking about recently because there was a really instructive example, I think, in the past few weeks, which was Paul Kagame having his election in Rwanda a month or so ago, I think, which he won with 99% of the vote. And immediately after this result comes in, Canada congratulates him. They say, we look forward to deepening our bilateral relationship with the Kagame administration, with the RPF, blah, blah, blah. Yet when Maduro wins his election with 52% of the vote, it's immediately condemned as fraud. Just, they say it like it's an obvious fact that this was fraud. He stole it. This is unacceptable. We stand with the Venezuelan people. But that's because Kagame and the RPF, they serve a very important purpose for Western power. Whereas Maduro and the PSUV, they play a very important role in undermining North American power in the Western Hemisphere, but also Western power more broadly, with the Venezuelan government's promotion of multipolarity, of BRICS, things like that.
Yeah.
So, there's a pattern here. There's different elements that come into play in different examples, but I think to some extent, all of these elements are there. They're all at play. It's just a matter of which one is in the forefront of the given coup.
And second to last question is this: does the book talk at all about Greece's far right fascistic junta during the Cold War, and anything about Canada's support for the Portuguese fascist government and Spain's fascist government under Franco?
Portugal and Spain, there's no chapter on either. Portugal may be mentioned in passing because it does sort of relate to the Greece example, of which we do have a chapter
Oh,
concerning the
fantastic!
Greece coup, the coming to power of the junta there, because it's very interesting. Canada really backed the junta that comes to power in Greece. There were Greek communities in Canada which were organizing against the military dictatorship, and they were being surveilled by the RCMP. Prominent activists would have the RCMP show up at their door, harassing them, intimidating them because they were organizing against the Greek dictatorship.
Wow.
And the line that the Canadian government took was, well, Greece was in NATO, so they would say Greece is an ally. We're not going to improve the situation in Greece by putting pressure on an ally. We'll do it in a friendly way. We'll do it from, within NATO. We'll find a way to resolve these questions. But like you point out with Portugal, Portugal under Salazar was a founding member of NATO, I believe. It was a fascist
Yeah.
government. So fascism has always been part of NATO. It's not like Greece under the military dictatorship was an exception. It fit in very well. And Canada had very good relations with the military dictatorship in Greece. And again, it shows with the military dictatorship, they were suppressing the left, they were suppressing the progressive movements in Greece, which is what Canada likes to see. So, of course, we supported the Greek military dictatorship. It's the same reason we support coups anywhere. Doesn't matter that they're in NATO. In fact, we like that they're in NATO. They're a good ally.
And actually I have to ask this: anything about Turkey or Cyprus? Because Turkey also had although Turkey has always had an autocratic streak even under Ataturk, but Turkey's left government was also overthrown in a coup, and a very vicious right wing junta throughout much of the Cold War was in power. Anything about Turkey and Cyprus in the book by any chance?
No, I don't think we touch on either of them, and those are histories that are less familiar to me for sure. I'm aware
See,
of the fact that
I'm definitely inspiring you and you to do another book then.
yeah, I think that was your intention with this interview. But I do know some of the history of Cyprus, like they had that left-wing leader whose name is escaping me, the priest, and then the
Yes,
US
yes.
had him overthrown. I mean, it's the same thing. I'm sure Canada supported that diplomatically and behind the scenes, but in terms of a chapter in this book, we just didn't see the documentation that would warrant like a full investigation.
No problem. And I and I promise this is my last follow up question, and then we'll get to the question there, and then you can enjoy the rest of your Saturday. But one, but I have to ask this. But I have to ask this. Uh, what's something that strikes you about like what's a common thing that Canada often does when they support the overthrow of a democratic government, of a government that's trying to do what Canada does for its what Canada did for its people post World War II, which is really trying to develop which is really trying to develop the country, have a middle class, not a grotesque gap between the working class and the the affluent rich. And I'm curious, what are some of the many things that strikes you about Canada's tactics? Because I believe with Iran, didn't Canada uh, uh, have like agents like infiltrate unions to start protests, and also doing the same thing in Chile with Salvador Allende in order to sabotage the economy, make the economy scream, and so forth. So I'm curious your response to that.
Yeah, so when you're looking at coups against elected governments or like these enemy states, these targeted states of Canada, of the US, of the UK, of Europe, there's definitely a pattern there, and it's important to recognize that pattern because you'll be able to see it when it happens in the future. So the coups, yeah, they often target nations that are governed by states that are limiting Canadian investment in some way, or imposing constraints on Canadian capital, or there's states where potentially the military goals or the geostrategic goals of the West are being undermined in some way. These are some of the key things to look for, but also in terms of the Canadian campaigns against these governments, the actions of the Canadian state, you'll see the demonization right away. Like if you look at Maduro in Venezuela, it's not only the Canadian government's demonization, but it's the Canadian media as well. You're not going to find an article in the mainstream Canadian media that says one good thing about the Venezuelan government. They're just that you won't see it, which should tell you something. Like, why is that? Why is this country being demonized so much? Why is Canada trying to isolate this country diplomatically, severing ties, things like that, organizing the opposition? I mean, you mentioned the example of Iran, but with Venezuela, there were Canadian officials on the ground organizing the opposition, and they were bragging about it in Canadian media. Like the most flagrant
Wow.
violations of a country's sovereignty, they were doing it. So, I mean, Venezuela, you don't have to investigate at all to see what Canada was doing there. It was being bragged about in the Canadian press. But I think you will see a lot of common occurrences with all these coups. I've had people tell me this about the book, me and Yves' book, because the chapters are short, but they're very factual and they're very well researched. So people will say the chapters go by quick and they almost meld together and you just see the pattern. You kind of forget the specifics of certain chapters maybe, but you see this pattern forming. Oh, there's the demonization, there's the aid cut off, there's the funding opposition groups, things like that. There's the destabilization. So the pattern, I think once you know this history, it becomes very clear. And I think it's very important to know the pattern because Canada is going to keep doing this.
Yeah.
I don't think Venezuela kind of became Canada's main focus in the hemisphere, at least for a while. Maduro's not going anywhere. They're probably going to keep trying the same things to get him out. It's not going to work. But there'll be another Maduro in the future, another person who is implementing policies that undermine the wishes of the Canadian government in some way, and they'll be demonized. And we'll see the same things. We'll see the diplomatic isolation. We'll see the aid cut off. We'll see the funding of opposition groups. It'll be the same thing. But you'll be prepared for it at that point if you know the pattern.
Well, here's hoping with this book, which both you and Eve has done, that the Canadian left, however big or small, gets its act together and mobilizes like hell against those wars, the way they would against mining abuses in Canada and the abuse of and the apartheid and the Indigenous people face, as well as the police
Mhm.
brutality that both Indigenous people and Black people face. So,
Mhm.
well, well, I think that's a very good place to end. But before I let you go, we usually end the program doing the questionnaire that was done by Marcel Proust, later the popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, the late Bernard Pivot, and of course perfected by my hero, the late great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Owen, it's your turn to do it before you go, so here it goes. What is your favorite word?
Favorite word?
Yeah.
Socialism.
What is what is your least favorite word?
Capitalism.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Ooh, meditation.
Interesting. What turns you off then?
Hmm. Not having a routine to work.
Okay. And what is your favorite curse word?
I mean, you can't go wrong with fuck. It's all purpose. You can use it in
Exactly.
many contexts. Yeah.
It is an ingenious word. And then what sound or noise do you love?
Scent or noise?
What sound or noise do you love?
Sound or noise? I don't know. I like those like springy keyboard sounds, like the old keyboards. That's very satisfying for some reason.
Okay, interesting. And then what sound or noise do you dislike then?
Velcro.
Okay, and then what profession, if you weren't doing the great journalism you're doing, the fictional writing you're doing, so if you weren't doing that, what profession would you love to attempt to do?
I think lawyer, you know, help out
Okay,
social movements, do something a little more tangible. Yeah.
okay, interesting. And then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Anything related to finance. Can't do it. Morally or intellectually, it just would not work out.
Yeah, you see, I have the advantage of having dyscalculia, so I can't do anything in
Uh,
finance. But even if I was like, even if I didn't have that, yeah, there's just no way I could see myself
mm,
working for like a Wall Street firm or some big like corporate
oh God, no.
firm.
Mm.
And finally, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision of the afterlife? And even if you're an atheist, please do answer the question.
I think just you did good. You spent your hours well. You helped some people, you educated some people. That's all I could ask for.
And I'm pretty sure he would say the exact same thing. Well, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One, our All Things Canada edition with Owen Schalk. Owen, of course, is an independent journalist whose articles are often published at Canadian Dimension, other publications as well, but mostly Canadian Dimension and the Maple. He is also a short story fictional writer and writes also essays on arts and films, which people can find on his website, which I'm going to make sure to link. He is the author of Canada in Afghanistan, a story of military, diplomatic, political, and media failure 2003 to 2023. And he is the co author of the book we've been talking about, Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy, with Yves Engler. Owen, it's been such an honor to talk to you for an hour. The next time you come
Oh,
on
you as
the
well.
show, we have got to talk about Canada and Afghanistan because it's well, it's a
Absolutely.
fascinating topic, and yeah, and we just have to talk about it. And
Mhm.
having interviewed Scott Taylor not too long ago, oh my
No,
gosh, like Afghanistan, talk about like
he's great on that. I borrowed quite a bit from his writing, from his perspectives on Afghanistan. Yeah, I can imagine that was a great conversation.
exactly. So I definitely have to have you back on the show to talk about that. But until then, Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that this will be the first of many conversations, both on and off the air.
Great, thank you. Looking forward to future interviews.
Likewise.